Hey, I'm Pep, and this is a Pep Talk. Now today, we're going to talk about evolution. Charles Darwin was born on February 12th, 1809, and after much research, he released his book, Origin of Species, in 1859. This book detailed how creatures evolved and changed based on their surroundings. Though controversial at the time, and sometimes still today, it really changed how we look at the animal world. Speaking of animals, in 1835, Darwin rescued a Galapagos tortoise from the Galapagos Islands and named it Harriet. In 2006, Harriet died. And that made me sad because I like turtles. 10 years prior, in 1996, Pokemon, which heavily uses evolution as a basic idea in the game, released the red and blue versions in America. One of the starter Pokemon is Squirtle, which is a turtle. Coincidence? I think so. Anyway, this video has nothing to do with any of that. What we're actually going to do is talk about evolution and some of its expansions. Normally in these kind of videos, I'll talk about a specific type or genre of games, but instead, I'm going to go for a single game and see how that works. One of the best parts about getting multiple versions of the same game is that I can get more of these bags with turtles on them. Yay. But they also include a lot of extra trait cards, extra food tokens if you've been running out, extra rules, and just extra things that your evolved creatures can accomplish. So we're going to start with tips that apply to all of the evolution games first, and then we'll move on to specific examples from the flight or climate expansions. Now, if you happen to have the ocean version of the game, I'm not going to be talking about that because from what I understand, it isn't really the same thing. Plus, I've never played it, so I don't really want to give you advice on something I've literally never played. Alright, so the game is just beginning. You have your first species, and you're given a hand of cards, and you have to decide, what do? Well, first of all, there's a lot of carnivore cards in the game, so there's pretty good odds you'll have a carnivore card in your hand. But, if this is your first game, I do not suggest being a carnivore. Ever. Because it is very risky. At one point, you can be put in a situation where you literally can't eat even though there's tons of food around and you just die. And I get it. I get why you want to be a carnivore. Doesn't everyone want to eat their friends? Phrasing. Doesn't everyone want to eat their friends' animals? Still not right. Eating animals is fun. Good enough. But pushing your base desires aside, there's usually going to be a lot of food available for your animals to eat. Usually. But if you find you're getting into the position where there isn't a lot of food to eat, don't worry, you don't have to be a carnivore. There are traits that will allow you to cheat some food into your animals' bellies. Long neck lets you eat food that essentially doesn't even exist. Combine that with something like foraging, and you can continue to eat from this nonsensical plane. Maybe you'll also have a trait like migratory that lets you take other food from other non-existent places. Or maybe you're a scavenger and you eat the things that the other carnivores are eating. All I'm saying is that you can continue to eat without being a carnivore even if there's no food. But there's an important thing you need to think about. On your turn, you're using your cards essentially like actions. Discard a card, increase your population. Discard a card, increase your body size. Discard a card, create a new species. Discard a card. No, that's it. You might even play a trait onto one of your creatures. But the thing to think about is that if each of these are an action, what is one of the most fundamental rules in games? The more actions you get, generally, the better. This game is 100% no exception. So one thing you can do is to have extra species, because this has more cards coming into your hand each turn, which means more actions. But unlike other games, it's very easy in evolution for you to lose those actions. Because if a carnivore eats you, or even worse, if you starve, you lose all those actions that you spent essentially in previous turns. And that's bad, especially if you're just going to spend the next turn putting your population back up. So, if it gets to the point where everybody is starving, don't desperately keep putting your population up, hoping that it's going to stay there. Instead, figure out exactly what the minimum, or just barely above the minimum, is for the amount that you can actually eat, ignoring the food that'll end up in the center. That way, you guarantee that your species are going to stay the same. Make more of them. Give them traits like long neck and things like that so that they can survive without having to rely on the food in the center. And the game isn't always going to be flowing the exact same way. Sometimes there'll be a lot of food early and not as much food later. So traits like fat tissue will be really helpful. You can store up some extra food now, and then later you can eat that food. But something else important to think about is when there is an abundance of food, that's a great reason to just go crazy. Put your population up really high. If you have fat storage, put it onto a creature. The more food you can eat, especially out of the center, the better, because you're going to quickly accumulate points. Now, of course, the other players are going to be doing the same thing, so you have to work smarter than they are. And of course, one of the easiest ways to work around the other players getting points is to eat them. So let's just skip the whole bit about don't be a carnivore, and let's just do it. Let's say there's just so much food, but you want to force it down. You're going to start putting negative food cards in, you're going to start eating them. You want to make a carnivore. That's actually another fun thing about the fat tissue that I talked about. If you have an abundance of food, you can increase both your population and body size if you have fat storage, and it means that you'll be able to eat more. And then as the food starts dwindling down, all you have to do is put in a carnivore card onto your creature. Now, you still have the same abilities of the fat tissue, you're just going to fill it with meat instead. But you've already upped your body size because of how much it was benefiting you from fat tissue. So you're kind of doubling down that way. Another little trick that might not instantly click is something like Scavenger says whenever a carnivore eats. You are a carnivore. When you eat and you take your meat, you still take the extra meat from Scavenger as well. So a scavenging fat tissue creature can very quickly and very easily turn into a carnivore at great effect. Now I'm betting that probably sounds easy, so why don't I just make carnivores all the time? It's hecka dangerous. There are so many defensive cards in the game, and while there are offensive cards to counteract them, a lot of them are very specific. If you want to attack something with climbing, you need to have climbing. That doesn't sound very good, especially because in the next round, they're just going to add another defensive trait if you can eat them, so you constantly have to shift things. And what did I tell you? When you're spending your cards, you're essentially throwing away actions. So if you keep having to switch your cards out in order to be able to attack, it's not being very effective. The easiest way, in my opinion, to be able to eat is to look for the pack hunting card. This essentially adds your population and your body size together when figuring out if you're big enough to eat things. Assuming you've also been increasing your body size, which is a good idea if you're a carnivore, it means not only can you eat things that are large, you can eat things that are at the maximum size, which normally you couldn't, and you can also eat things which have hard shell. So not only does it negate the normal size bonus that things have for protection, but it also negates an actual defensive card. In my opinion, this makes it one of the best. Now, I hear some echoes in my head of, but what about intelligence, Pep? I don't do intelligence. But there's a reason I don't do intelligence. And that's because of what I was talking about earlier. Actions. First of all, you need to hold cards in your hand, which I do not suggest, especially if you're new to the game. Do not hold cards in your hand. You could be increasing your population, you could be increasing your body size, you'd be giving yourself traits. Holding cards, while it can be a good idea in some cases, is actually kind of a bad idea in most cases. Create an extra species. If you're going to hold the card anyway, turn it into something that is going to get you a point for the food that it eats, and it's going to get you another card in the next round. So that's why I don't like intelligence. You're forced to hold on to cards, and usually you would probably need to hold on to multiple cards because you're going to have to negate multiple traits or like a trait each round in order to attack if there's something big that you're trying to get through. Is there going to be situations where it's a good idea? Of course. All I'm saying is don't look at it like some magic card that can just solve all your problems. It's not. It's kind of just draining your points away in order to do the same thing as a different trait would do. But you know, there is a safe way to have a carnivore. And that's to purposely create your own creature that the carnivore can eat. Now, I don't suggest doing this as its main food source. But the point is, if you have a creature, let's say one that has fat tissue, so it's stocking up extra food, and it is a large body size, in a pinch, you can eat that creature to instantly fill yourself because you eat an amount of food equal to the body size. So that way, instead of your carnivore starving and you losing a lot of points, you get to save it and only lose one population on this other species. And of course, something else big to think about is that, like most board games, the point is to have the most points at the end. So keeping your creatures alive, while it does net you some points, isn't in theory the main focus. It's eating as much food as you can. So if you have the chance to increase your creature's population and you know you'll be able to eat food, it makes more sense to do that than to constantly shuffle through traits to try to defend them. If you're really worried about things eating you too much, increase your body size up, not only to protect yourself, but to make it so you'll be eaten less. If you have a population of 5 and a body size of 1, something with a population of 6 that can eat you can kill you in one round. That's bad. So heavily think about increasing your body size in order to make you a less appetizing target. Ironically, because in theory, in the actual animal kingdom, you'd be a more appetizing target. Okay, that's enough about just the basic idea of evolution. Let's talk about flight. The flight expansion adds more traits, and it also adds event cards, which put an interesting spin on the game. But no, I will talk about them later. But just the flight in general creates that extra little food pool that constantly gets restocked, regardless of what people are doing. But it is only restocked an exact amount, the number of players in the game. And creating a flying creature takes 2 cards discarded instead of 1. Don't worry though, you get the flight trait, which is technically a card. And the flight trait does allow you to bypass some abilities if you're a carnivore, which is pretty handy. And you might think, well, a carnivorous bird isn't all that good because you can only bring the body size to 3. Well, I did bring up a really handy trait earlier called pack hunting. Also good for birds. Now, the important thing to think about when creating birds is how many other birds are already in play. If every player creates 1 bird, for example, the pile of food that's building in the bird section is going to dwindle extremely fast. On the other hand, if it's gone 3 rounds and nobody has built a bird, it's probably a good time to do it. Of course, the birds can eat the food out of the middle as well. That being said, if you have a bird, you should be eating that food first. It feels mean. It feels very mean, in fact. But if you have the ability to take food away from other players when you have your own private source of food somewhere else you can get to any time, yeah, that feels good. It also gives you an auto defense against a lot of the carnivores because they have to have flying in order to attack you. Or intelligence, of course. But when people have to throw away cards just to attack you, yeah, you're kind of winning. Let's swoop on in now to talk about climate, because it's a much different game than the other 2. Though you're still using all the same traits and a couple new ones that are specific to climate, there's a very different thing happening with the climate board. Whenever you're putting your food cards in the middle to determine how much food is going in, you're also affecting the weather in some way, either keeping it the same or making it colder or warmer. Now at first, this can create some extra food, for example, if you try to make it warmer. But eventually you can get to the point where it's so hot that your food is starting to burn. And your species are starting to burn too. Now I don't think being cold is any better. You're going to lose creatures that way as well. But each of the side has a very distinct way that it happens. Warmth focuses on harming things that are a larger body size first. So it's more detrimental often to carnivores. Cold, on the other hand, damages things that are small first. They're not big enough to keep themselves warm. And so it's more detrimental often to herbivores. But there's one card that makes a big difference in determining which direction is better or worse. That card is heavy fur. Some traits will protect you against population loss. It might protect 1 population loss to heat or 1 population loss to cold. Heavy fur, while it does have the downside of causing extra population loss in heat, it gives you 4 population protection when it gets too cold. That means that you can have a creature that is completely protected from the damage of cold entirely. Now, of course you're thinking, but I see what happens when you get that cold. There's no food. That's true. But luckily, I've already told you how to handle both of those situations. As in whether you're a carnivore or an herbivore. But I'll talk about it again. As an herbivore, you'll want to get a lot of cards that let you either ignore the need to eat or let you eat extra food out of nowhere. If you happen to be mixing expansions, having a bird, for example, with heavy fur in the coldest possible situation is really handy. Because that food on the cliff isn't going anywhere, unless you rule that it does. It's not super clear. We play it as safe though, which makes for a fun, super heavy furred bird. If you don't want to fly, or can't, all you have to do is think about the things we talked about before. Fat tissue, and again, things that let you eat food out of nowhere. But the obvious creature that can have heavy fur and survive is a carnivore. You have so much to eat because all the other creatures will be around the table. That's assuming that they can survive. But luckily, in order to survive, they're going to have to spend a lot of their traits on climate protection and less of their traits on you protection. So in case I'm not making it clear, a really good strategy, especially if this is your first time playing, is think about pushing it cold, assuming you found some heavy fur, and if you don't start off as a carnivore, eventually becoming a carnivore to harvest all the people that are there and unable to protect themselves. There's one big obvious downside to this though. First of all, if you don't get heavy fur. The other is if you try to create a new species, you have to have heavy fur in your hand. Now here is where I'm going to break one of my previously stated rules. Sometimes it's a good idea to hold cards in your hand. Not for intelligence, although you can bluff like you're going to use it for intelligence, or that you've played an intelligence card this turn, or if you're a flying creature, you might bluff that you're keeping it for that. Either way, what you instead want to hold cards for is, let's say you get 2 heavy furs early on. You know what you want to do. You know that strategy you're going to apply. You're going to put heavy fur in that creature. But do you really want to throw another heavy fur away? I don't think so. I think you want to hold on to that heavy fur, because when it gets later in the game, other people are going to be tossing away card after card to keep increasing their population, to keep things alive, to keep increasing their body size, to get them out of the range where the cold's going to be hurting them. There's going to be a lot of essentially wasted cards. So it's not a big deal that you're holding on to one, especially when the one that you're holding on to is something that will give your creature essential immunity to the type of weather you're pushing for. And this can happen in other situations. Maybe you get a cooperation early on, and so you want to save that. You want to keep that card because you know you're going to need it for the kind of strategy that you're planning. You don't have to play turn by turn. However, I don't suggest holding on to more than 1 card each round. Sure, if you happen to get 2 extra heavy furs, that could sound amazing, but you still have to be able to get cards to play on these creatures and build them up, and you're just going to be holding on to these cards that could be spent on increasing population and body size over a long period. So yeah, I'd suggest keeping it to 1. The other fun thing about holding on cards is that I talked about the flight expansion earlier having event cards. These event cards are played in response to some things like attacks, or as a way to boost an attack, or as a way to make extra food come in. Either way, they just do extra things. And on top of that, after you've played them, they let you draw a card. So those are cards where having intelligence could actually be fairly useful, because not only can you use the event, but afterwards when you draw a new card, you can use that card for the intelligence ability. But that's not really why I wanted to bring it up. That feels a little obvious. The other less obvious thing to do is to bluff. There's not a lot of the event cards in the game, but if you do get one in your hand, it can make a big difference, especially Last Stand. So acting like you have Last Stand can make you a less appealing target, which means you can bluff your way into protecting yourself just by holding a card in your hand. Maybe after you hold it up, or even whenever you're holding it up, you in the rest of your hand, you look at it, you give like a smile or a smirk, and then you set it down, and then look at the rest of your hand to plan the rest of your turn out. That could just be a heavy fur, it could be whatever. But the thing is, people might notice you doing that and instantly putting that aside and thinking, that's got to be an event card. He doesn't need to look at it with the rest of the cards, he knows he's keeping it. Yeah, it's tricky. And one other quick thing I want to talk about when it comes to bluffing is you are able to get rid of traits in order to put new ones in, and those new ones you put in will be face down. So a big thing is that depending on the turn order, you might be throwing away something like your Carnivore card early on, which gives the other people at the table the signal that, okay, we don't need to protect our creatures anymore. He threw away the Carnivore that he had. Well, did I? Did I? Because the card I put face down can be another Carnivore card. Yeah, so if you do want to be Carnivore and you want to be sneaky, again, you're technically wasting a card. But it isn't a waste of a card if it means that you're going to completely be able to feed this turn. It's no different than if you had to add another trait, and maybe you don't have enough room for another trait. So that might be a sneaky little way to get some bites in. And on top of that, I can almost guarantee you that people are going to remember that and talk about it for quite a while. Anyway, I feel like I've said a lot. There's lots of little strategies. There's lots of combinations you can use with cards. I don't want to get into exact combos though, because I don't want to tell you how to play it. It's more fun when you discover those things on your own, I find. But hopefully the general tips I gave you are enough to help you up your game if you've been having trouble winning in a game like Evolution. Although I guess in that one, the word climate is bigger than evolution, so maybe the game is called Climate. But before I go, I do want to give you a suggestion for how to make the game run a little smoother. So in the book, it does talk about for a 5 or 6 player game, you might want to do simultaneous turns. That's actually pretty handy. And even for a 3 player game, if you're just feeling like you want the game to run faster, you can do the same. Now, it is important that you're not really supposed to be looking up and seeing what people are doing because the turns are supposed to be simultaneous. That being said, it's hard when you're a Carnivore to know what you can and can't attack. So, when it's your turn and you have a Carnivore, I think it's a good idea for you to say, I have a Carnivore, I have 5 body size and climbing. Who can I attack? Anyone who can be attacked, put your hands up. That means that rather than the Carnivore having to constantly scan the table and figure out all the math on everything, each player can do it individually and speed the process up. You can even say that this is how much food you'll get if you attack my species, or you get 2 different species. Just find a way so that the other players make it clear quickly, rather than trying to slowly deceive the Carnivore. Especially in big 5 or 6 player games, I think that'll really speed your game up. And it feels like just kind of a nice thing to do. And isn't that what we want to do in a game about eating each other and surviving? Want to be nice to each other? I guess not. We probably want to eat a lot of people. Not me. I usually try to stick to carnivores. Herbivores. Unless I'm like sticking to the Carnivore like a parasite so they can't eat me. Oh. Anyway, that's been my pep talk. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions or you want to talk about some of your strategies when playing any of the evolutions, put them in the comments below and I'll take a look. But until next time, I'll eat you later.